Well, thanks so much for inviting me here today. I hope that you all have had a chance to either see some of the wildflowers on display at the museum or get out and about and see some in your neighborhood. All right, so I've given many talks on this topic of the Southern Inyo Mountains over the last few years. So I thought this time around I would give a different version of this talk, sort of freshen things up a little bit. So today will be the field guide edition of the talk, and the focus will really be on the plants, where to find them, when they're blooming, and how to recognize them. I'll cover some more widespread plants of the Mojave and Great Basin deserts, and also touch on some of the rare and endemic plants that can only be found in the Inyos or desert mountain areas. So here's what you can expect during this talk. First, I'll give some background information, then we'll embark on our tour of the Southern Inyos, and then I'll spend the last few minutes talking about some conservation concerns. So my knowledge of the Southern Inyos really stems from my master's research completed at California Botanic Garden, where I worked on a flora. So in case you're not familiar with what a flora is, I thought I would define that real quickly. So it's essentially a comprehensive checklist where we establish baseline data of a given location. A flora is typically based on natural history collections, which are preserved in perpetuity in herbarium collections or herbaria around the world. In my case, a lot of the collections from the Southern Inyos are located at Riverside, UCR Riverside, most of them at California Botanic Garden, some at Jepson, and some at Cal Academy of Sciences. So it was a lot of fun to look at these older specimens. And for a graduate student, completing a flora is a great way to gain encyclopedic knowledge about the plants of a given area. So here is the area I chose. It's the Inyo Mountains. I wish I could have done the whole range during my master's, but it's a pretty long mountain range, about 60 miles long with hardly any roads. So I decided to focus on the southern extent of the range. For those of you that are visiting from Ridgecrest down here, the Southern Inyos are pretty much due north past the Argus and the Cosos and the Panamints to the east. So outlined here in red is the very southern extent that I focused on. These are part of the ancestral homelands of the Timba Shoshone and Lone Pine Paiute Shoshone tribal nations who still live in the area and steward these lands today. The entire area I focused on is about 167 square miles with quite a steep elevation gradient. Starting right here at the lowest point, this is near the mouth of Daisy Canyon at 1,800 feet. And just 6 miles to the south is Pleasant Point, all the way up at 9,694 feet. These days, most of these lands are administered by the Bureau of Land Management, although there's a few hundred acres of private inholdings, mostly left over from the historic mining era. Some of the place names to pay attention to here are Malpai Mesa, Conglomerate Mesa to the north. I don't have it labeled, but Cerro Gordo is in this private inholding area. And then for those of you that know Death Valley National Park, that's just to the east of the Inyos. I did want to touch on some of the designations here because these will play a role in the conservation section at the end. So we have 2 wilderness areas, the Malpai Mesa Wilderness in green, and then a section of the Inyo Mountains Wilderness. Pictured here in this orange, in the study area, these are national conservation lands of the California desert, and outlined in black is an area of critical environmental concern, ACEC as some people know it. Both of these designations confer that there are nationally significant values here that deserve careful management so they can be preserved for future generations. Okay. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like on the ground, this is near the mouth of Daisy Canyon. This is the low point in the study area, dominated by creosote, although in exceptional rain years, this area is just packed with annuals, hence the name Daisy Canyon. The year I visited here, it was pretty dry, 2021, and all I saw were skeletons. On average, this area gets about 4 inches of precip a year, although it fluctuates pretty wildly. It's a much different scene here at the high point. This is at Pleasant Point, just at 9,694 feet. There's bristlecone and limber pine. There's mountain mahogany in the background. And this region gets a lot of snowfall and quite a lot more precipitation, averaging about 14 inches annually. So another reason why I selected the southern area, apart from the steep elevation gradient, which to be fair is pretty consistent in the whole Inyos, the southern area is the meeting place of two ecoregions, the Mojave Desert, pictured here in the orange, and the Great Basin, pictured in the green. Also, for those of you familiar with Jepson subregions, both the White and Inyo Mountain subregion and the Desert Mountains, both which are known for having relatively high levels of endemic plants for the desert, they meet right here. So I was very curious if I would encounter plants that would basically get to the edge of their range in this area. It's also pretty great views. I think this picture, in some respects, just demonstrates that this is an exceptional area. There aren't many places you can be in a Joshua Tree woodland at 7,000 feet, staring at the snow-covered Eastern Sierra. This place also has quite a diverse geology. So the very southern area is mainly volcanic rock, so rhyolite, basalt. This is where we see a lot of the more common Mojave Desert species. But as you get further north into the limestones, dolomites, the shale of the Inyo crest, we start to see a lot of Inyo Mountain endemics. Also, there's some granitic intrusions, which have interesting plants. And then at the periphery of the study area are these alluvial deposits, which includes things like desert pavements and sand dunes. All right, so despite all of those interesting qualities, there really hasn't been that much botanical documentation until recently. Most of the historical collections that were made in this area are from the Cerro Gordo Road leading to San Lucas Canyon. There was pretty much no collections made at Conglomerate Mesa, this area here. And in the Malpais Mesa area, only Munns. In 1947, he spent about a day and a half. He's the only person who had made historical collections here. Although I will say that Mary D. Decker does deserve special mention. Many of you may be familiar with her work. She was very devoted to the botany of the Inyo Mountains and really Inyo County as a whole. She visited the southern Inyo Mountains at least 12 times, where she made collections. She probably visited other times as well. She lived in Independence, not too far away. And she compiled an amazing checklist of the Inyo Mountains, which is, you can actually find this on the Bristlecone CNPS website. It's been updated by our member, Jerry Zatorsky, who's done a lot of work in the area. But Mary really didn't depart much from the roads. And so when I began my work, I was really interested in one, confirming what she had already found, but then also seeing if there were new plants that could be added from these more roadless areas. So I'm going to fast forward and just share the results of my research with you. So between those historical collections and what I did, we've made well over 1,000 collections, and those are illustrated by these points here. These total 370 minimum ranked taxa, so that's species, subspecies, and varieties. And there are numerous rare taxa. So far, I've documented 33, which comprises 9%, which is quite high. So, I really don't have time to introduce you to all of those, but I wanted to introduce you to some of my favorites. And so this is where our botany tour is going to begin. I thought it would be good to introduce you to some of these plants on a seasonal basis. So we're going to start with the early bloomers. So for those of you that are familiar with the desert, it's hard to say when spring really starts. This is a photo from March, and you might be able to make out some snow on the crest of the Inyo Mountains back here. There wasn't a whole lot in bloom at this time. This year, it seems like spring is starting quite a lot earlier, although I just drove by this area in the Inyos and not much is up. But if it were a good rain year and you were exploring in this area, this is where you might want to start. So here's the Owens Lake bed. This is the intersection of 190 and 136. There's actually a little parking area here. And for those of us that don't have four-wheel drive, this is actually a great place to check out plants in a good rain year. So you just park there, walk across the highway, and you'll be greeted by sandy washes. There's a few small sand dunes. And if you're feeling really adventurous, you can extend up and keep walking into some of these deep washes that turn into canyons. So one of the first things you might see is this plant in the mustard family, the California shield pod. This is quite widespread around California, especially in the desert areas, and it flowers really early on. It's pretty unmistakable because of these spectacle-shaped fruits, and the plants are quite densely hairy. So another plant you might encounter in the sandy areas, at least in the southern Inyos, is this species, Cleomella obtusifolia. It does occur in varied habitat throughout its range, but I noticed in the southern Inyos it seems to be limited to the very lowest elevations near that parking area I showed you. I haven't seen it out too much this year, although I just looked on iNaturalist and there is a recent observation in Trona. So perhaps some of you have seen this out. It does have quite a long blooming period. It's one of the first things to bloom, but if there's enough precipitation, it'll just keep going. So also those of you who are in the desert probably know that Onaggraecii are some of the first flowers to bloom. Pictured here is Chilesmia brevipes. I saw a few plants in the sandy areas, but it's really around here, it's in the rockier washes and then also up into the Joshua Tree woodlands. Something I realized when I was doing my Flora, because I hadn't worked in this low of a desert before, is that if you want to key Onaggraecii, you really need fruits. So I had been fooled by seeing these early spring flowers, but I had to be patient and wait for fruit so I could key them as I was getting to know them. So when you're keying out Chilesmia, you want to look at the fruits and note the width, and if those widths stay steady throughout the whole fruit. So these have fairly narrow fruits that are the same width throughout. And there's 3 varieties in California, but they do integrate. Actually, this photo here I took, this was one of the few individuals that actually has these red spots that is more characteristic of variety Palladula. But most of the individuals in this area are just plain yellow flowers. Additionally, is the herbarium folders were showed evidence of that. And I just saw a note that my internet was unstable, but hopefully things are better now. But if my internet slows down again, just drop me a note in the chat and I'll wait for it to catch up. So something you might have seen around blooming are Connactus. So Connactus species bloom quite early in the spring. I've seen the Connactus fremontii around. This species, though, Carpoclinia, occurs near that parking area I showed you, but more in the rocky areas towards Malpais Mesa. You can see this volcanic rock in the background. This species is in the sunflower family, Asteraceae, and One thing you'll want to note are the size of the flowers, the radial flowers. So in Carpoclinia, these outer flowers are a similar size to the inner flowers. Additionally, these filiary tips are long and pointed, and that can help distinguish this from similar looking species like Fremontii. All right, so another one that you might be seeing around that you can also find in the Inyos are Gilia species. This one in particular is showy Gilia, Gilia cana, subspecies triceps, quite common in these rocky washes and also extends up into the Joshua Tree woodland on the east side of the Inyos. One thing I wish I had known when I started my Flora, that maybe some of you know this, you know better than I did at the time, is it's really important when you're keying Gilias to take photos of the flowers because the flower color and how the color is distributed along the tube and the throat is essential for keying these out. So take photos and they will help you in the end. This is another species in Polemoniaceae, a close relative to the one I showed you before. This is Leinanthus filiformis, occurs in similar habitat to that Gilia I showed you in these rocky washes up into the Joshua Tree and even into the sagebrush. I haven't seen it around yet, but I hope to see it this year. And finally, I wanted to close out our early spring section by talking about this Cymopteris. This is purple Cymopteris in the carrot family. And this one blooms way, way early at higher elevations. I think the first plant I saw was in the first week of March, and there is still snow everywhere. And this was on a little melted out rocky area. This one, you can see in Rocky Hills, in the Desert Mountains, in Death Valley National Park, the Mojave Preserve, and I think in the Mountain Pass area. That's a good place to find these. So with that, we'll move on to late spring. So in late spring, if you're doing a Flora or trying to track things down, it's sort of a mess because the early spring flowers are still going, the perennials are starting, and it's pretty fun because you'll start to see new things blinking in as others start to blink out. You know, one thing I also should have mentioned is that my seasons here are somewhat subjective, and they're really oriented around the timing of what I've seen in the southern Inyos, but there are other variables like latitude, elevation, and just seasonal precipitation and temperature patterns that can play a role in what blooms when. So your experience with what blooms in early or late spring might be different than what I'm presenting. Okay, so with that disclaimer out of the way, let's hit this next plant, Allium atrorubens cristatum. So this one, the leaves, you'll notice them coming up early in the spring, and you might even see some flowers arising here and there, but I found in the Inyos, these are really going later in spring in May, probably because more of them occur at higher elevations. And yes, they do smell like onion. I haven't tasted them yet, but they probably do, although I wouldn't want to eat them because these are on the rare list in California. They're on the watch list. They're ranked a 4 if you're familiar with those ranks. So another plant on a similar timeline is Bludix. This used to be in Dicola but it's now in, I don't even know how to pronounce this, but I'll give it a try, Dipterostemon. Don't quote me on that. There's only one species in California. It's quite widespread, and you can recognize it. It's fairly ubiquitous, has 6 stamens, but there are several subspecies, and these subspecies do need more research. It sounded like, yeah, there's just some more work that needs to be done. But the way these subspecies are circumscribed now, what you really need to pay attention to is the bract coloration and the number of flowers. So for instance, these bracts have purple streaks. And this plant in particular was an odd one. It had quite a few more flowers than other individuals I saw. And so this actually puts it in between to describe subspecies. So that was one of my confusing taxonomic, let's see, one of my just things that was confusing the key in this flora. But most of the subspecies here came out to subspecies Passiflorus. So another plant, similar color, but quite unrelated, is the desert beard tongue. This is Penstemon fruticiformis. This occurs in canyons, both in PJ, creosote, from the Southern Sierra to the Northern Mojave. So it's fairly widespread. But I wanted to show this plant because I found this interesting note in Flora North America that underscores why sometimes it's good to read resources besides the Jepson. So I was a little puzzled by these plants I encountered because the outside of the flower were very glandular. And that is actually a quality, a character that's distinctive in variety Amargosa, which is quite rare. It turns out that's actually not quite such a distinguishing quality. Flora North America says, quote, let's see, corollas glandular pubescent externally are found in plants in the last chance and Panamint ranges, and now the Inyos. So don't be confused if you see glands on the outside. Make sure you're also looking at other characters like the calyx and flower size. So something I would love everyone to keep an eye out for this spring is Malacothrix torii. So first of all, I love Malacothrix. You might know these as desert dandelion. There's some that occur at lower elevation. They might even be in the room right now at the Wildflower Exhibit at Matarongo. And these are cool because, well, in Asteraceae, if you don't know, these little floofy things that help disperse the seed, they're called pappus. And it's one of my favorite things about the sunflower family. And this genus has two. It has a double pappus. And the thing that's special about Malacothrix torii is this outer pappus has a few bristles. This is what distinguishes it from a more common species, Malacothrix sonchoides. And something else that distinguishes the two is the distalmost leaf, so that's the leaf that's furthest from the base, is more strap-shaped, whereas the more common Malacothrix is wide at the base of the leaf. And the reason why I would like everyone to keep an eye out for this, and if you can, post your observations on iNaturalist, or if you have a permit, make an herbarium collection, is there are very few collections of this in California. They're in Eastern California, all the way from the Whites and Inyos up to the Modoc Plateau, but I believe there's only 6 or 7 occurrences. I know there's less than 10, but because this species is so widespread in Nevada and elsewhere, we think it probably is more common in California. It's just underdocumented. So if you're able to document this, this could help with deciding whether this is in fact should be listed as a rare plant or if it is more common. Okay, and one more I wanted to show you. This is Bochara shocklei in the mustard family. And I just wanted to show you this one because it grows in this really special habitat on these calcareous rock outcrops. So this is one, you can actually start to spot it in early spring because of this rosette here. It's quite recognizable. And then it flowers probably late April, but I actually think it's most recognizable when it's in fruit in late spring. It has 20 to 70 flowers and fruits. By then it's totally elongated and the colline leaves obscure the stem, making it quite easy to recognize. And another one that you may find if you're lucky in late spring is this one. This is Nemacletus inyoensis, and those flowers are teeny, so you have to look closely for this one. So really you're lucky if you find any Nemacletus, but especially so if you find this one, because there are only 12 known occurrences. They're mostly known in the White and Inyo region, although I think Matt Berger has noted an occurrence in the Panamints, but that population sounded like it's quite small with just a few plants. So because of these limited populations, this is ranked as very rare in California. It typically flowers in late May, early June, and it does need adequate precipitation in order to flower. It could be, this is part of the reason why it hadn't been described until relatively recently. I think Steve Matson had photographed it about 10 or 12 years ago, and then Nancy Morin and Tina Ayers finally described it in 2020. So it's new to mainstream science, which is quite exciting. So this one, you can find it at several locations in the southern Inyos near Conglomerate Mesa, actually along the road that was going to be used for mining exploration, which I'll tell you about more at the end of this presentation. Okay, so with that, I had to make up a new season for this presentation. I'm calling it cactus season. I wanted to feature all of the cacti I know of that occur in the southern Inyos, and they kind of bloom throughout the year, but everyone loves cacti, so I wanted to feature them here. We'll start with this one. This is one of the ones that are quite widespread. This is Opuntia basilaris, which you may have seen blooming near where you are. I was driving near Red Rock and I saw one in bloom. I can't remember exactly where. I also saw an iNaturalist that's blooming near Whitewater right now. But this one does bloom quite a bit later in the Inyos, probably because it occurs at higher elevation. So I see this one going mid to late May. Now, this Opuntia species lacks spines, but be careful because here are all these glochids. And even though they're small, they pack a punch and they're hard to get out of your skin. So yeah, don't go petting these cacti. If you do want to pet a cacti, this one is probably a better option. The spines are actually fairly soft and flexible. This is Opuntia polycantha, the Mojave prickly pear. It occurs at, it has quite a lot of overlap with the one I showed you before, but this one does get a little bit higher. Up in the Joshua tree, pinyon juniper, and I've seen it even fairly close to the limber pine. Let's see. And that's what I was going to mention. So this variety is more widespread, and it's fairly easy to recognize because it has these spines that sort of twirl and are recurved, and they're fairly flexible. That's why I said you can pet them. Okay, so this one is a little bit more rare. This is the Mojave fishhook cactus, Sclerocactus polyancistris. And this is more common elsewhere in the southwestern US and into Mexico. But in California, you'll find it on limestone, creosote scrub, up into Joshua tree. I've even seen it near the pinyon juniper. And this one, you know, you can recognize, see these little curved spines at the end. That is one distinguishing character, as well as the prominent ribs. And also note that the flowers occur at the very top of the plant, so they occur above the stem. And that's in contrast to this other pink flowered cactus, the calico cactus. You'll note that the flowers arise laterally, so off the side of the stem. So you may know this one from where you are. The flowers are purple to lavender. It kind of blooms around the same time in May, around May. And it's a very close relative. The Mojave mound cactus is easy to distinguish because of these bright red flowers. Pretty unmistakable. Here's a picture of a small mound. And a lot of times, even if you miss the flowering, you can see remnants of the flowers that help distinguish it. It also has more spines. The other one has more spines, but these ones have bigger mounds. And once you get to know them, they're fairly easy to distinguish from Engelmannii. All right, so now we're getting into the late blooming cactus. I had to wait a long time and trudge through some very hot, hot weather to find this one in flower. This is the cotton top cactus. Some people can mistake this for a pharaoh cactus, but just look to the top of the plant and you'll see these cottony tops, hence the common name cotton top. I really like it when the common names fit the plant. So like I said, this one blooms in July. I took this photo, I think second week of July, and there were still many plants that were in bud that hadn't bloomed yet. So another one that blooms fairly late in the season is this cholla, the silver cholla, Cylindra puncha echinocarpa, also has yellow flowers. And I wanted to include this landscape shot because just it illustrates what's so cool about the southern Inyo Mountains. You have this silver cholla, which I think of more of a low desert, low elevation cacti, cohabiting with this Joshua tree and then a low elevation pinyon pine. So I really loved encountering these types of meeting places. And so, you know, when you see these blooming though, the silver cholla and the cotton top cactus, you know it's the heat of summer. Pretty much most of the other plants are senesced. There's not much going on. So it's a good time to head to the higher elevations. So in the southern Inyos, by higher elevations, I mean the higher parts of Conglomerate Mesa and then up along the spine of the Inyos towards Cerro Gordo and along the ridgeline to Pleasant Point, and even some of these eastern slopes have some great summer blooms. So this is what it looks like on the ground. This photo is from the north, looking sort of southeast to Pleasant Point. This is the high point, Cerro Gordo, Belmont. The Belmont mine is here. If you're ever out this way, you might notice this very prominent white dolomite looking outcrop, and that's what this is, Belmont. And then Conglomerate Mesa, this flat area here. So these are all great places to go in the summertime. And oh, one other thing I wanted to note is this is actually where you'll find a lot of interesting endemic plants. So the lower elevations tend to be more widespread. The plants up here tend to be more rare. And it really is a different world up here compared to elsewhere. The pinyon juniper continues all the way up. You can sort of see that in the background. But you start to see limber pine, bristlecone pine, these interesting shale fields that are sparsely vegetated, and the associated species totally change quite a lot. They tend to be more allied with the Great Basin. And part of the reason in the change of species here is there are many protected north-facing, even more mesic areas that are spring-fed, and there's pockets of interesting plants like this maple, Acer glabrum, var diffusum. I remember seeing this in a distance, and I hadn't seen anything that looked like that. It was tall, it was really green, even though it was, I think, August when I was out here, and I was so curious to see what it was. And lo and behold, this is something more common. I've seen it a lot in the Eastern Sierra and other desert canyons, but it was great to see it here. I've only seen it in 2 locations in the southern Inyos. And it was a great surprise too to see one of my favorite species. This is Calochortus brunonis, the pinyon mariposa. This will come up in years where there's just average moisture, but it's in 2019 when we had that great rain, there were just fields of this intermixed with sagebrush, tons of Indian paintbrush as well. It's really a sight to see if you can make it here in a good rain year. Okay, this is another one of my favorites. I think all these plants are my favorites, but I especially like astragalus quite a lot. This is the Inyo milkvetch, Astragalus inyoensis. It's rare in California, on the watch list. It's mainly restricted to the whites and Inyos. And this one you'll find in pinyon juniper woodlands, usually on carbonate soils. I've seen it in quartzite gravel as well, although not in any great number. That's a perennial, and it grows really close to the ground. And it's quite a small plant, although these fruits are pretty leathery. They last quite a long time. So this is one you can recognize pretty late into the summer. Another interesting find, this is one I found recently. Let's see, I had surveyed over 100 days in the Inyos and hadn't ever come across this plant and wasn't really expecting to see it because it's much more common in northern Inyo County. This is Penstemon scapoides, the pinyon beard tongue. This one, it's quite recognizable because of the leaves. So when I found it, I had been seeing these mounds of leaves everywhere, no flowers, because this was 2021, not much was blooming. And then finally, high up in the canyon, we found a plant in bloom. And it has these very long purple flowers, long and narrow. And if you look closely, you'll see that the inner margins of the anther are glabrous, which distinguish it from other species. But I would say, you know, if you're in the southern Inyos, you really aren't going to see anything else growing in a mat like this. So another late summer bloomer is the crescent buckwheat, Eriogona mensicola. This one is considerably more rare than the other two I showed to you. This is also a BLM sensitive species. Pretty much just occurs in the desert mountains in Eastern California and gets a little bit into Nevada. Although I did find that it's quite locally common in the conglomerate mesa area at the edge of the pinyon juniper woodlands. It looks a little bit like Eriogonum panamitense, but you can distinguish it if you look at the leaves. So the leaves are round, they're tomentose, and the involucres are slightly different shaped than panamitense. They're more bell-shaped. And I don't know if this character holds true elsewhere, but I noticed in the Inyos, let's see, this one blooms quite a lot earlier, about a month earlier than panamitense. All right, I talk about this plant in every slideshow because it's pretty much the poster child of the southern Inyos. It occurs nowhere else in the world. So this is the Inyo rock daisy in the sunflower family. It is extremely rare. Its entire range is about 23 square miles, extending from just north of Cerro Gordo down to Conglomerate Mesa, and then there's a disjunct population at Malpine Mesa. So if you took all of those places where it occurs, squished them together, it would occupy less than 1 square mile. So it's quite rare. Not only that, but everywhere it does occur overlaps with mining claims. So it's incredibly threatened. And for that reason, myself, the California Native Plant Society, and the Center for Biological Diversity submitted petitions to list this plant as threatened or endangered under both the California Endangered Species Act and also the federal act. Interestingly, this had been recognized as worthy of listing all the way back in the 70s by the Smithsonian, but there just hadn't been enough research done at that time. So thankfully, there is an amazing researcher. His name is Isaac Lichter-Mark, who's been focusing on this whole group of rock daisies. And he helped add a lot of knowledge so that we could move forward with the listing process. This one does have close relatives that occur nearby, but you can distinguish this one by looking at vegetative characters. So the leaf margins are more serrate and it has long hairs. So that'll distinguish it from megalocephala and I think villosa. Okay, so one more high elevation plant I wanted to show you about is Cycladenia humilis. So if you've never seen this plant, you have to go out and look for it. It does occur all over California, Arizona, Utah. There's a few different varieties, but you have to go up into the mountains. So they have quite a fragmented distribution. They just grow at higher elevations. In the Inyo Mountains, they're in these shale slides above 8,000 feet where pretty much nothing else is growing. So they really stick out. They have these succulent, fleshy, vegetative parts. And when they're in bloom in July or August, they have these bright pink flowers. This is actually a special variety, special meaning it was recognized by Alice Eastwood back in the early 1900s as being a new variety, but it wasn't really proven or documented as such until some recent research out of Brigham Young University. And so it sounds like they have a publication in the works. So hopefully this will get named and listed by CNPS so it can be protected. Oh, and one more plant. There's too many plants to cover, but this is another great high elevation one that blooms really late around the same time, July, August. This is Matte Roxspirea in the rose family, Petrophytum caspitosum. Grows right out of the rock. It's quite incredible. All right, so last but not least are the late bloomers. I can relate to these plants, so they're some of my favorites. They're mainly Asteraceae that you'll see out here. This is rabbit brush, and it really just lights up the hills, especially in the higher elevation areas. In the lower elevation areas, in a good year, a good rain year, when there's summer rains, you might find this, Pectus piposa. This is something much more common lower in the lower deserts. So I was surprised to find it in the Inyos. And this was after some good summer rains in 2018. And it turns out it hadn't been documented on any of the Inyo checklists. So I'm sure others had seen it before, but it was great to see this and get it documented. So another late bloomer is Brickhellia longifolia, the longleaf bricklebrush. Now this plant puzzled me. I kept seeing it in these canyons. It never bloomed. Every time I saw it, it's super bright green. It just looked really out of place compared to all the desert plants. And then finally it dawned on me like, oh, this must bloom really late in the year. So because of the drought, I still haven't seen it in bloom, but fingers crossed, I'll find it this year. There are 2 varieties in California. So if you're interested in distinguishing the 2, you'll want to note the shape of the leaves and whether or not they're folded. So this one happens to be variety multiflora because of the folding and the sickle-shaped leaves. And last but not least are the sagebrush. So these are late bloomers. IDing these sagebrush has also made me pull out my hair. Maybe some of you have dealt with similar sagebrush problems. I was glad to hear that Jim Moorfield has run into similar issues in the whites. But up here we have black sagebrush and also a few instances of mountain sagebrush, which is much taller, has wider inflorescences. But a lot of the time there were these puzzling situations here. Vegetatively, they would sort of look like mountain sagebrush, but the inflorescences would be more like black sagebrush. It's a puzzle I would like to figure out someday, or at least hope that some intrepid grad student could possibly help with figuring out. So with that, just to close out our tour, just some quick notes on some of the observations I compiled. We were able to add, with the help of many volunteers, we were able to add 58 taxa to the Inyo Mountains checklist, which I hope to update in the next year when I complete my publication. Another 200 taxa were newly documented in the study area, mostly because people just, botanists who were making collections hadn't really been off the road before, and then filled in the range edge for another 20 taxa. I think most significantly is the finding that about 9% of the taxa here are rare. So that is relatively high for a desert flora of this size. And so that's one of the reasons why conservation in this area is so important, because of these many rare and endemic plant species. So just to give you a bit of background about what's happening threat-wise to this area. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of my talk, I told you about these conservation areas here, the area of critical environmental concern in black and the national conservation land in orange. This is the very area where mining companies have tried to drill for gold over the recent decades. And what they found is, what they think they found is a very large deposit of submicroscopic gold. Now, this type of gold typically needs quite a lot of processing in order to be profitable. There's quite a lot of ore per ounce of gold, so a lot of material that needs to be worked through, typically in the form of an open pit mine. So right now, there's hundreds of active mining claims in this area. Here's a chronology of all the different mining activity that has taken place here. Most recently in 2019, a company called K2 Gold, they're a mining exploration company based in Canada. They acquired many of the claims right around the time I started my research here, and it has been quite a wild roller coaster, wondering if a mine was going to get built in the middle of my Flora that I was working on. Something else I learned while I was working on these mining threats is, because I was really puzzled, why is this area that's really set aside for conservation, how come people are still able to explore for minerals here? And this is in large part due to the 1872 mining law. This was established at a time where the mining industry was, people were using pickaxes and dynamite, quite different than today's modern operations. So back in the day, this law was established, and it's still to this day interpreted as the highest and best use of certain federal lands. So land managers sort of feel like they're more limited. They can't just outright say, no, you can't mine here because of this law. I also found out that this area had been looked at for its wilderness values, but back in 1990, it wasn't actually recommended for wilderness, even though it met all the qualities. And at that time, it was felt not to be distinctive or important enough compared to its mineral value. But in this day and age, when our Joshua Tree woodlands are burning, when there's much more use, recreational use of public lands, I wondered if this question maybe needed to be revisited. Additionally, in the last few years, we've documented many rare and endemic plants here. And it's clear that this area biologically is quite special and deserves protection. Something you may be aware of is the high elevation Joshua trees that occur here and elsewhere in the Inyos. And you may know that this species is actually a candidate species under the California Endangered Species Act because it's so threatened throughout its range, but especially in the southern part of its range. It's threatened by development and climate change. And climate modeling has suggested that most of the Joshua trees in California will be extirpated by the end of the century. And there's very few places where they're expected to persist. And one of the places is in the Inyo Mountains. And this place is very special. It's about 6,500 to 7,000 feet. There's many regenerating Joshua trees here. And it's a high elevation alluvial deposit. So it's as opposed to these rocky exposed slopes, this is an area that's more well suited to the physiology of the Joshua tree. So it's one of the reasons that, if this area were to be turned into an open pit gold mine, it could actually have pretty serious consequences for the future of this species. So if this is something you are interested in learning more about, I encourage you to go to this website, protectconglomeratemesa.com. There are many organizations and individuals working to protect this area for future generations. You may have heard in the news that K2 Gold, that mining company, they've decided to put a hold on their operations. And while we all have been breathing a sigh of relief because of that, we recognize that they're the 11th company that's come along, and there probably will be more. So we really would like to see this area permanently protected. All right, so with that, I would like to thank you all for listening and to thank everyone who has helped me with my research, both on the funding side and also with permitting and of course field help and help in the herbarium. So with that, I will stop talking, take a break, and see if there's any questions.
So does anybody have any questions they want to ask Maria? Not so far. Okay. Well, I think we will, oh, we have a chat. Can you read that, Maria?
I can.
Okay.
Thanks, Colette. Thanks for the kind words. And I hope this inspires you all to go look for some flowers. I know that the precipitation has been spotty this year, but like Elaine said at the beginning, there's some flowers out and about Ridgecrest, and I think Red Rock State Park is a great spot to go right now.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, Maria. We appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar. It was really good. Thanks again. We're going to close down. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and end it. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.